By the time I understood the voices were trying to make me answer in the right order, the water was already at my knees. Column 9 was louder inside than any storm I had ever worked through. The sea hit the outer shell in blunt, arrhythmic impacts that traveled through concrete and steel until the whole chamber seemed to pulse around me. My flashlight beam shook over the flooded floor, over rusted cabinets, over a wall covered with names written in grease pencil and then crossed out so many times the concrete looked skinned. They stood beyond the far grating where the service tunnel narrowed. Not one person, for at first, then 7, then more, stepping out of each other as if the dark was producing them faster than I could count. Graham, Lisa Merritt, Nate Barlow, then me. My own face watched me from the threshold with an expression I had seen only once before, reflected in a courthouse restroom mirror after I signed a statement I knew was incomplete. "We can do this simply," it said in my voice. Behind it, something knocked from inside the pillar wall. Once, twice, then all of them asked at once, calm as auditors. "Who did you leave on the bridge, Evan?" The maintenance lights outside began to ignite in sequence through the drainage slits, crawling across the span like a thought learning how to cross. 48 hours earlier, I took the job because nobody else would hire me, and because the Cascadia Infrastructure Authority used the kind of language that made failure sound temporary. They did not call it a second chance. Human Resources called it a reassignment opportunity for candidates with field experience in high-risk environments. What they meant was that I had spent 11 years around large concrete and steel structures, and that whatever quietly followed me out of my previous job had not reached their liability threshold yet. Officially, I had been terminated for negligence. That was the word on the paperwork. Negligence. It had a passive feel to it, like a spill or a missed turn. It concealed the more precise truth, which was that on a bridge rehabilitation project outside Tacoma, I had altered 2 inspection reports and softened a 3rd so the firm could delay costly repairs until the next budget cycle. I told myself it was standard pressure, ordinary compromise, one of the 1,000 small dishonesties that kept projects moving. 6 months later, a section of the maintenance access way partially collapsed during a storm inspection. 3 people were injured. 1 suffered spinal damage. The investigation did not prove that my reports caused the collapse by themselves, but they had concealed enough corrosion to matter. So I left before a trial that never happened and accepted a maintenance position in the Pacific Northwest, where the bridges were longer, the weather meaner, and the communities they served too isolated to ignore. The network was stranger than anything I had worked on before. It was not one bridge or even one corridor. It was a chain of suspension bridges, service causeways, and maintenance links stretching across fjords, inlets, and narrow marine channels along the coast. Some connected small towns tucked into evergreen valleys. Others led to artificial islands built solely to support pumps, relay equipment, emergency shelters, and storage depots. The system had grown in phases over decades, stitched together by state money, defense grants, emergency access planning, and the stubborn logic of infrastructure. Once something existed, more things had to be built to keep it alive. My assignment covered 6 structures on a rotating route, though in practice everyone crossed into everyone else's territory whenever weather or staffing turned bad. I spent my first morning on an island station half hidden by drizzle, filling out digital forms while diesel heaters clicked in the corners and gulls hit the roof with their feet. Around me, the veteran crews moved with a silence I first read as competence and later understood as economy. Nobody here wasted words unless words solved something. Orientation was handled by a supervisor named Graham Pike. He was in his late 50s, narrow-shouldered, with the colorless skin of a man who had spent years under fluorescent light and cold sea wind. He wore an orange safety shell, old composite boots, and the expression of someone permanently half-occupied by a second conversation. He showed me the control room, the maintenance bay, the emergency lockers, the tide monitoring dashboard, and the stacked binders that still existed because systems this old never fully trusted digital storage. Then he handed me a laminated card. "Keep it on you," he said. I looked at it and almost laughed, but the room was too quiet for that. The card listed 5 rules. Rule 1. If you see someone standing beneath the bridge during low tide, do not wave. Rule 2. Never inspect support column 9 after sunset. Rule 3. If maintenance lights illuminate ahead of you in sequence, turn around immediately. Rule 4. If another worker asks whether the fog reached the water, answer no. Rule 5. If you hear knocking from inside a support pillar, continue walking. I read them twice, then looked up. Graham was watching me with a patience that made me feel younger than I was. Local hazing tradition? I asked.
No.
Liability theater?
No.
He waited. I expected some explanation involving unstable transients, visual distortions over water, acoustics in hollow support structures. Something awkward but practical. I had worked in enough remote places to know that odd procedures often emerged from one real accident and a dozen bad retellings. But nobody smiled. Nobody rolled their eyes. A woman across the room was signing out climbing gear with one hand while glancing at my card, as if checking whether I had been given the same version everyone else used. What happens if you break one? I asked. Graham took a beat too long to answer. Depends which one. Depends when. That should have unsettled me. Instead, it irritated me in a familiar way.
Institution liked ritual.
They liked unofficial knowledge disguised as wisdom. I had spent years in offices where people hid bad math under tone and certainty. The card felt like the field version of that. Still, I put it in my jacket pocket. That afternoon Graham drove me across Mercerspan in a salt-streaked authority truck. The bridge crossed a gray throat of water between a mainland service road and an artificial island station built on poured fill and pilings. The towers vanished into low cloud. Moisture gathered on the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. To our left, the water moved in dull, muscular folds. To our right, a strip of shoreline appeared at low tide. Black rock, kelp ropes, driftwood jammed into angles that looked deliberate from a distance. Most of the work's routine, Graham said. Corrosion checks, expansion joints, cable band inspections, drainage, lighting, sensor diagnostics. Don't get ahead of yourself. Learn the route first. I nodded. Each bridge has its habits, he added. Habits? He kept looking at the road. You'll see. By the time we reached the island, I had decided the rules were an inherited superstition made useful by repetition. Maybe a worker once waved to somebody below and got distracted. Maybe column 9 housed an access shaft with bad footing. Maybe the lights sequenced during electrical faults, and the dramatic wording kept technicians from walking into live failures. I could rationalize all of them if I tried. That was one of my more dependable skills, making a dangerous thing sound ordinary until I could stand next to it without shame. That night, in the small rented room the authority provided above the island workshop, I copied the rules into a notebook because I did not trust laminated cards in wet weather. The rain tapped at the window. Somewhere below, a pump cycled on and off with the breathy rhythm of somebody trying not to be heard. I wrote the rules neatly. Then beneath them I wrote a 6th line for myself. Do the job correctly this time. I slept badly. In the hour before dawn, I dreamed of a bridge inspection report I could not finish because each page kept returning wet, with fingerprints that were not mine. For the first several weeks, the rules demanded so little of me that I almost resented being asked to remember them. Work began before daylight more often than not. We drove out in rain or fog, parked in fenced maintenance pullouts, and clipped onto narrow catwalks beneath decks slick with salt and spray. I checked drain lines for blockages, logged chloride intrusion at hairline cracks, photographed cable clamps, listened to bearings groan under live loads, and learned which spans trembled under logging trucks versus passenger traffic. Once you spent long enough around big structures, they stopped seeming inert. Steel had temperature moods. Concrete held damp in ways that changed sound. Entire bridges developed personalities built out of resonance, deferred maintenance, and weather. The Pacific Northwest helped with the illusion. Every bridge seemed to emerge from weather rather than resist it. Fog came in low and thick enough to erase both shorelines at once. Rain moved sideways. The water below was rarely still, and even on clear mornings it reflected light in broken, metallic pieces that made distance hard to judge. But the work remained work. I did not see anybody standing beneath a bridge during low tide. I did not inspect column 9 after sunset because Graham scheduled around it without comment. I never encountered maintenance lights turning on ahead of me in sequence, unless you counted standard system tests, which came with radio warning and did not feel remotely ominous. The question about fog reaching the water never came up except once, when a younger electrician named Sarah asked me if I had read my orientation materials. When I told her I had, she said, "Good," and nothing else. As for knocking from inside support pillars, I heard it on my 12th day and nearly laughed with relief. I was walking the interior service corridor of Harrow Bridge, checking moisture penetration along an access seam, when a dull series of taps came from inside the adjacent column. Not frantic, not loud, just a measured knock-knock, pause, knock. The sound had enough shape to suggest intent, but hollow structures produce all kinds of convincing acoustics. Tide pressure, thermal movement, trapped debris, loose conduit, birds. I kept walking because the rule told me to and because I had no reason not to. "Good," Graham said later when I mentioned it. "Good that I ignored probable thermal expansion?" He looked at me over the rim of his coffee. "Good that you kept moving." We were in the island break room, if it could be called that. A metal table, 2 battered microwaves, lockers with peeling labels, and a window that showed mostly rain. Graham always drank his coffee black and hot enough to steam the lenses of his safety glasses when he lifted the cup. He had become, if not friendly, then available. He corrected my log formatting, showed me the difference between staining that mattered and staining that merely photographed badly, and once spent 20 minutes explaining why a certain tower ladder always held more ice on its north side. He did not waste time, but he invested it. After my first month, I found myself looking for his truck in the lot the way people look for proof that a room will proceed normally. "You actually believe all 5? I asked him that day. He stirred nothing in his coffee. "Belief doesn't enter into it." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got. Come on. You've been out here how long?" "Long enough. And..." His jaw moved once. "The rules weren't necessary until 3 years ago." That line would have sounded theatrical from almost anyone else. From Graham it sounded unwilling, which made it more effective. I waited for elaboration, but none came. He stood, rinsed his cup, and left me with the smell of burnt coffee and wet canvas. That answer should have lodged harder than it did. Instead, it fit too neatly into the story I preferred. Something had happened 3 years ago. An accident, maybe, a disappearance. Management, wary of another lawsuit, institutionalized a set of behaviors because procedures felt better than admissions. Workers filled the gaps with folklore. That was how systems protected themselves. Once I decided that, everything unusual seemed to flatten. A deckhand on the resupply ferry mentioned seeing a person under Mercer span at low tide. "Just standing there," he said. "No gear, no boat, nothing." Sarah shrugged. "Probably driftwood." The deckhand looked insulted. "Driftwood doesn't look up." Nobody argued with him. Nobody investigated either. Another time, a welder named Miguel told us he had heard a woman humming from inside a decommissioned utility shaft. Graham asked where. Miguel told him. Graham crossed that section off the afternoon checklist and assigned us elsewhere. There was no discussion, just a silent change in route. It was all easy to live with as long as the consequences were invisible. That is how most dangerous arrangements sustain themselves. They ask almost nothing at first, only enough obedience to become background. I began to think the rules served the workers more than the bridges. Remote jobs accumulate rituals because isolation demands shape. People in harsh environments like certainty even borrowed certainty. If a crew believes certain phrases keep bad luck at bay, those phrases become part of the safety culture whether or not they map to any real threat. That idea pleased me. It was rational without being dismissive. It let me feel smarter than the superstition while still participating in it. I carried the laminated card. I followed the rules because they were harmless and because doing so cost less energy than fighting group habit. I also liked how little anyone here asked about my past. The authority had my employment file, of course, but coastal maintenance stations were full of people who had come from somewhere else with some version of a sealed box behind them. Divorces, DUIs, debt, burnout, dead-end military careers, bad jobs with worse endings. Nobody said as much, but I recognized the etiquette. You took a man's competence as his opening argument and let the rest arrive later, if it ever did. Only once did that loosen. We were on night standby after a wind advisory, sitting in the control station while gusts struck the bridge deck in long buffeting waves. Sarah was scrolling through sensor diagnostics. Graham was writing up a lubrication schedule in block capitals. I was watching the camera feeds cycle through views of empty lanes, swaying hangar ropes, and the black water below. "Your name came up once," Sarah said. I turned. "What?" "Before you started. Somebody from Central said you'd done failure analysis." "Inspection work," I said. "Mostly." She nodded as if I had confirmed something trivial. "Guess that helps out here." Graham did not look up, but I felt the shift anyway. Not suspicion. Recognition. I kept my eyes on the screen until the next camera cut. Beneath the bridge, the tide had fallen enough to expose a stripe of rock and weed-slick concrete near one of the shore anchors. For a second I thought I saw somebody standing there, almost hidden by the camera angle. Then the image pixelated in the rain and resolved into nothing. I did not mention it. I told myself, not for the first time, that I was being careful now. That this job would stay small and honest if I kept it that way. That whatever had gone wrong in Tacoma belonged to a finished version of me. The rules helped with that story because they were easy. Easy rules create the comforting illusion that danger is measurable. Follow these instructions, avoid these points, answer this way, keep moving, turn around. No moral weight. No complicated judgment. Nothing like the old decisions, where numbers and deadlines had to be interpreted by men who wanted promotions more than repairs. By the end of the second month, I had become comfortable. That was the beginning of the actual mistake. I broke Rule 1 by accident, which made it easy to treat as a test. The evening had gone longer than planned. A wind event the previous night had tripped an alert on one of Mercer Span's cable anchor sensors, and Graham sent me to verify whether the issue was mechanical drift or actual movement. By the time I finished the upper check and climbed down to the anchorage access route, the light was already draining out of the sky. Not dark yet, but close enough that the world had lost clean edges. Fog had started moving in from the channel. It came low over the water and climbed as it advanced, pouring around the underside of the deck and through the stiffener trusses in pale sheets. Sound changed with it. Traffic overhead went from separate tires and engines to a continuous hush. My own boots on the grate seemed close and private, as if I were hearing them inside a helmet. I had just finished photographing a corroded guard at the cable shoe when I looked over the rail and saw someone below. The tide was out far enough to expose a long seam of dark shoreline beneath the southern quarter of the span. Kelp lay in glistening loops over stone. Pools reflected the dim sky. Standing on the wet margin where rock met retreating water was a single figure in what looked like a dark rain shell. My first thought was that it was a fisherman or one of the locals who ignored restricted access signs whenever the tide permitted. My second was irritation because if he slipped and drowned below an authority structure, the paperwork would breed like mold. I leaned out and raised a hand. It was a reflex more than a choice. The same empty gesture you use to get somebody's attention across distance. The figure looked up immediately. Then it waved back. The motion was ordinary. That was the worst part in retrospect. No jerking delay, no wrong angle, no theatrical stillness before movement. Just a simple return wave, shoulder high, almost friendly. I felt a brief jolt then, less fear than the sensation of remembering something a second too late. Rule 1. If you see someone standing beneath the bridge during low tide, do not wave. The figure held my gaze for another second, though I could not make out a face through the fog and distance. Then it turned and walked into the white shifting curtain rolling along the shoreline. I waited. Nothing happened. No lights failed. No voice called my name. No impossible shape rose from the water. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, hands still half lifted, feeling foolish in the damp cold. Then I climbed back up, finished the inspection, and drove the truck to the island station through thickening fog with the heater blowing stale hot air at my knees. At dinner I almost told Sarah about it just to hear how absurd it sounded once spoken aloud. I decided against it. I did not want Graham's look across the table. I did not want the faint tightening in the room that came whenever one of the rules migrated from abstraction into anecdote. Instead, I went upstairs, showered, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed while rain clicked against the window frame. I expected unease to arrive in force once I was alone. It did not. I felt embarrassed, then slightly amused, then stubbornly rational. If the rule existed to prevent workers from engaging with trespassers, I had technically violated it but suffered nothing because the man below had merely been a man. If the rule was superstition, I had just proven that too. That should have been the end of it. Weeks passed. Nothing changed. Work remained routine. Graham remained taciturn. The bridges swayed and groaned through weather. Reports got filed. Cable temperatures got logged. Ferry schedules shifted. Low tides came and went. I heard more stories from co-workers, all secondhand and irritatingly imprecise. Somebody had seen lights under a span where no access path existed. Somebody else had heard their own ringtone coming from a locked valve chamber. A painter on relief crew swore he had met a new hire who never appeared on any staffing sheet. Every time I checked details, the stories dissolved into weather, fatigue, or the remote habit of embellishment. Meanwhile, my broken rule continued to produce exactly no consequences. That altered me faster than I understood. I stopped reading the laminated card before each shift. I began treating the rules as broad caution rather than strict command. If an access task ran close to sunset, I did not panic about the clock as long as I was nowhere near column 9. When a series of maintenance lamps flickered on ahead of me during a known voltage hiccup on Mercer's East Catwalk, I turned around because procedure said so, but I did it smiling. I had acquired the confidence of a man who believes he has seen the mechanism behind the trick. One afternoon, while crossing a fogged in-service lane with Graham, he asked without preamble, "Has the fog reached the water?" I knew the correct answer. Rule 4 was the easiest of the lot. Answer no. Instead, I glanced over the rail. The water and sky had merged into one pale, depthless field. Looks like it. Graham stopped walking. Not dramatically. He just stopped with one boot half-turned, as if listening to something I could not hear. Then he said very quietly, "No, it doesn't." There was enough force in his voice to irritate me. "Right?" I said.
No.
He resumed walking. Later he asked whether I remembered the exchange. I said yes. He looked relieved in a way I did not understand and told me not to improvise. That night I wrote in my notebook that the rules depended too much on context to be useful. I wrote that any safety system built on vague triggers invited confusion. I wrote, though not in those words, that I distrusted instructions demanding obedience without explanation. The irony would have been cleaner if I had actually been a principled man. The truth was simpler. I liked discovering that the rules could be broken. It gratified a part of me that had survived Tacoma intact, the part that mistook getting away with something for competence. Delayed consequences look an awful lot like vindication when you are eager enough. By the time the first real sign arrived, I had already trained myself to discount it. That sign was paperwork, which tells you something about the kind of horror I was built to recognize only after it had become personal. The first altered report looked like a clerical error. I opened a maintenance file I had completed 2 days earlier to append a photo set, and found 3 additional lines under the drainage observations. They were written in my usual terse style, tagged with my login, and time-stamped at 2:13, an hour when I had been asleep in my room above the workshop. The new lines read, "Noted movement beneath access grading. Human silhouette present. No interference." I stared at them long enough for the text to flatten into shape without meaning. Why? My report picked up a phantom edition. What kind? I told her. She did not react the way I expected. No joke, no eye roll. She just set the screwdriver down and asked, "Which bridge?" "Mercer." "Which side?" "South Anchorage." She nodded once, as if confirming a category. "Print everything important. Because the software's bad? Because digital logs change faster." I waited for more. She gave me none. That bothered me more than the altered entry itself. Technical glitches invite solutions. Quiet acceptance does not. A week later, I found a maintenance photo in my upload queue that I had definitely taken. Same date, same angle, same rust bloom around the base plate, but there was an extra person in the background. The figure stood far down the catwalk, partly obscured by diagonal bracing. Hot. Orange shell. Head turned toward the camera. At first I thought it was Graham. Then I zoomed in and saw the proportions were wrong. Too broad through the shoulders. Too still. The face blurred when enlarged, not pixelated so much as smeared, like a human outline under moving water. I checked the full set. In 2 other images, the figure was gone. In one, it appeared closer. I brought the tablet to Graham. He looked at the photo for less than a second before locking the screen and handing it back. Delete it. You didn't even. Delete it. What is that? It's something you don't keep. His flat tone scraped harder than anger would have. You people do this every time, I said. Half a warning, no explanation. Graham's eyes lifted to mine. You want the explanation? Fine. Some things get easier to notice once they notice you back. I almost laughed because it sounded rehearsed, but he was not performing. The skin along my arms tightened anyway. I deleted the image. After that, the incidents multiplied and spread beyond files. A mechanic named Warren swore he had eaten lunch with a welder who had retired 2 years earlier and moved to Arizona. He described the conversation in detail. Weather, ferry delays, union benefits, until somebody quietly told him the welder in question had died of a stroke the previous winter. Warren got angry, then confused, then left the room without his lunchbox. Miguel reported hearing his brother call to him from the underside of a tower access stair. His brother had drowned at 16. Miguel admitted this only after Graham sent the rest of us outside. When he came back, his mouth had gone bloodless around the edges, and he refused tower work for the rest of the week. None of this became official. Officially, the network was understaffed, weather-beaten, and operating within acceptable safety thresholds. Unofficially, people started avoiding certain catwalks alone. We printed more documents. We checked each other's sign-out boards by hand. Small talk thinned out. The old quiet on the stations changed texture. It no longer felt efficient. It felt selective. Then it became personal. The first time I saw Lisa Merritt, I was sorting archived sensor data in the Mercer Station office just before dusk. She stood reflected in the blackened window behind the monitor. For a half-second, I thought the isolation and poor sleep had finally done what I had privately feared they might. Lisa had worked for the Tacoma Project oversight team. She was one of the few people who had pushed hardest when the inspection discrepancies surfaced. She had reviewed my revisions, requested originals, and nearly proved intent. Before the inquiry reached formal hearing, she died in a highway accident outside Olympia. That was the official report. Some selfish, childish part of me had felt relief so sharp it was almost grief. Now she was behind me in the glass. Same dark blazer under a rain shell, same hair tucked behind one ear, same appraising stillness that had made me feel measured in conference rooms. Only her skin looked damp, as if she had recently been pulled from cold water. I turned too fast and knocked my chair sideways. Nobody was there. The office smelled faintly of salt, though the windows were shut. I told myself then what frightened people always tell themselves first. Stress, guilt, association. The prior incidents had primed me. I was taking vague stories and giving them a face that fit my old damage. That explanation survived exactly 4 days. On the 4th day, while checking a pedestrian maintenance gate on Alder Reach Bridge, I heard a woman behind me say, "You changed the load notes after I signed." Lisa's voice, quiet, certain. I did not turn immediately because some part of me had already learned that not every instinct to engage should be indulged. When I finally looked back, the walkway was empty, but on the galvanized panel beside the gate, moisture had gathered into finger-drawn letters. I know why. The letters thinned and ran as I watched. I scrubbed them off with my glove until the zinc coating squealed. That night I did not sleep. The station radiator hissed. Pipes knocked in the wall, and every ordinary building sound arrived with new interpretive potential. I kept thinking about the figure beneath the bridge raising its hand in answer, about my own casual wave, about how long nothing had happened afterward, as if whatever response I had initiated needed time to learn me. The thing beneath the bridges was not producing random apparitions. It was selecting, not just dead people, not just familiar faces, the ones that mattered privately, the ones attached to unfinished accounts. Once that idea took hold, the older stories on the stations changed shape. Warren had not simply seen a dead man. He had seen somebody with whom he would have relaxed. Miguel had heard the one voice he could not ignore. Whatever this was, it was not haunting in the folk story sense. It was reconnaissance. And because I had already broken the first rule and survived the delay, I knew something worse than fear. I knew responsibility. I began looking for records because records had once been the place where I hid. There is a particular comfort in paper when you have spent years making facts negotiable. Paper sits still. It yellows honestly. It can be burned or lost or redacted, but it does not pretend not to have changed. Digital systems can be rewritten without visible scar tissue. That had been useful to me once. Now it felt obscene. The archive room on North Shoal Station was behind a locked fire door at the end of a corridor nobody used unless inventory forced it. The station itself sat on an artificial island built from fill and ringed with rock armor, a low utilitarian knot of concrete and steel that housed pumps, emergency cots, fuel tanks, and decades of accumulated paperwork nobody trusted enough to destroy. Graham gave me the key after I told him I needed old corrosion trend data for a column review. He knew I was lying, or at least omitting the center of the truth. "Don't stay after dusk," he said. "In the archive room? On the island." That was all. The room smelled of wet cardboard, mildew, and old toner. Metal shelving ran in rows from wall to wall, holding boxed inspection summaries, sensor logs, incident reports, crew rosters, and handwritten notebooks too irregular to fit any modern filing logic. A dehumidifier rattled in the corner, losing ground. I spent the first hour pulling official binders and finding almost nothing useful. Routine maintenance, deferred repairs, weather closures, staffing shortages. 3 years earlier, there was a sudden increase in procedural memoranda, route exceptions, and localized operational anomalies, described with bureaucratic caution so intense it became obvious by accident. Then, in a lower cabinet misfiled among tide calibration manuals, I found the journals. They were field books mostly. Spiral pads, black notebooks, water-buckled memo books with names written inside covers. Some belonged to engineers, some to electricians, some to deck crews or relief inspectors. A few had dates stretching back 15 or 20 years. The entries shifted between technical notes and personal shorthand, the way field writing always does under enough isolation. The rules appeared again and again, but not in stable form. One notebook from 4 years earlier listed only 3. Do not answer from below. Do not let it use your full name. If it knocks twice, leave. Another, written in a cramped left-leaning script, contradicted Rule 5 entirely. If the pillar knocks, knock back once and keep walking. If you ignore it completely, it follows. A third claimed Rule 2 was incomplete. Never inspect column 9 after sunset unless you have already heard it in daylight. Then sunset is safer. I sat on a plastic crate under the failing fluorescent light and copied everything into my notebook until my hand cramped. The contradictions did not feel random. That was what disturbed me most. They felt local, conditional, like field adjustments made by people who had survived different versions of the same problem. What management had distributed as a clean 5-rule system was a compression, maybe even a lie of omission. Then I noticed the missing pages. It happened first in a blue notebook whose spine had been repaired with electrical tape. Several leaves had been removed cleanly with a blade. The entry before the gap ended mid-sentence. It started using the same laugh he had in high school, which was wrong because the next existing page began 2 days later with, "Do not let it finish the conversation if it chooses somebody ashamed of you." I checked another notebook. Same thing. Removed pages clustered around certain incidents. Another journal had entire sections cut out near repeated mentions of column 9. In one, somebody had written page numbers at the bottom, and pages 44 through 51 were missing. Across dozens of journals, fragments repeated like debris washing back to the same shore. It learned names. Column 9 isn't where it started. Do not let it finish the conversation. It only needs one answer if the question is yours. Management changed the phrasing again. I was copying one of these fragments when I realized I was no longer alone. Graham stood in the doorway with his hood dripping onto the threshold. "How long?" he asked. I looked at the clock. It was later than I thought. Outside the small wired window, the day had gone from gray to iron blue. "You knew this was here," I said. "Yes." "You knew the official rules weren't the original ones." "Yes." "Then what are we doing? Why hand out a simplified version if it doesn't work?" He came inside, shut the door, and leaned both hands on the nearest shelf as if steadying himself against something larger than fatigue. Up close he looked older than usual, not merely tired but weathered inward, the way long exposure wears metal from beneath the paint. "3 years ago," he said, "we installed a new seismic and pressure monitoring package under Mercer and Harrow after a subduction scare. Deep sensors, tide-corrected readings. We got movement signatures we couldn't classify. Equipment malfunction. That's what we hoped. Then the signatures moved against current. The dehumidifier hummed in the silence between us. How does that become this?" I asked. "It didn't all at once." He spoke slowly, reluctantly, but once he started he did not stop. Workers reported seeing people below the spans where nobody could have stood. Audio pickups caught knocking patterns from sealed columns. Crews began encountering familiar voices on dead channels. A diver assigned to inspect scour protection refused to go back in the water after claiming somebody had touched his mask from beneath where the sonar showed open depth. Then came disappearances, first one explained as a fall with no recovered body. Then another, then 2 in one winter storm. So management wrote rules. Management collected what hadn't gotten people taken yet. Taken by what? His mouth tightened. If I had a good answer, I would have retired richer. Is it in the water? Sometimes. In the bridges? Sometimes. You hear how that sounds? Yes. He glanced at the notebooks in my lap. The problem with the journals is that people kept trying to understand it by turning survival into method. Method into procedure. Procedure into policy. By the time anything reaches a laminated card, half the truth has been sanded off. I thought of the missing pages. Who removed those? Graham looked at the shelves, not at me. Sometimes management. Sometimes workers. Sometimes the people who wrote them. Why? Because once it had enough detail, some of the rules started helping it. That should have pushed me into anger or disbelief. Instead, I felt the colder thing beneath both. Recognition. A system protecting itself by obscuring its own failure. A problem sustained because the record had been edited into usability. I stood too quickly, bumping the crate backward. You should have told me. Would you have stayed? I almost answered yes because pride loves hypothetical courage. But I knew the truth. I had come here because the job was remote and half-desperate. If on my first day Graham had told me there was something moving under the bridges that wore familiar faces and adapted to human rules, I would have left before lunch. He saw that answer land before I spoke it. As we left the archive room, he said, "Don't let it talk too long if it picks somebody from your life." You knew it had. I knew it would. Rain had started by the time we crossed to the truck. The island lamps made halos in the mist. Offshore, the dark line of Mercer spans stood against a sky that had lost all depth, just tower lights and steel geometry suspended above black water. On the drive back, neither of us spoke. I had wanted explanation. What I had instead was a set of contradictions, a trail of removed pages, and the growing suspicion that the thing under the bridges had not merely been contained badly. It had been educated. Once I accepted that the official list was incomplete, I made the mistake of thinking better observation might restore control. That is the engineering instinct at its most arrogant. If the model fails, gather cleaner data. Refine variables. Build a better procedure. I did not yet understand that I was dealing with something capable of treating observation itself as material. Still, I began keeping my own record. Not on authority tablets, not in station files, and not in the notebook I carried openly. I bought a cheap weatherproof pad in town and kept it inside a sealed tool pouch beneath spare gloves and alignment shims. In it, I logged every incident I could confirm firsthand. Time, tide, weather, bridge, whether I was alone, whether the voice or figure knew personal details, whether other workers perceived the same thing. Patterns emerged, though nothing as clean as I wanted. Fog mattered, but not always. Low tide increased sightings beneath the spans, but some encounters happened above deck with no visible water. The apparitions grew more convincing when they used private knowledge, yet the most dangerous ones seemed to know exactly how much to say before you volunteered the rest. That, more than anything, convinced me the thing was learning in real time. My notes turned from observations into provisional rules. Do not follow voices beneath the bridge, even if they know personal details. Do not trust anyone who appears during dense fog but leaves no footprints or drip marks. If someone references a memory only you should know, leave immediately. Then, after an encounter on Alder Reach that left me shaking in the cab for 20 minutes. If the figure acknowledges your guilt before you do, run. That one came from Lisa. I was crossing a lower service walk in morning drizzle, heading for a stuck access latch, when she appeared at the far end between two vertical braces.
No dramatic era evil.
I simply looked up and there she was, rain darkening the shoulders of her coat. I stopped. She did not come closer. You kept saying the numbers still fell within tolerance, she said. I had never told anyone here that phrase. It had come from the Tacoma review room, from my own mouth, repeated under fluorescent lights while I tried to recast concealment as interpretation. Go away, I said, because language collapses fast when terror is familiar. She tipped her head slightly. I know why you came here. Then, more softly, you wanted a place that already understood what to do with men like you. I moved backward without looking down, which nearly put me off the graded edge. When I caught the side rail, she smiled. Not cruelly, not triumphantly. With recognition. That was worse. I left the latch unrepaired and did not tell Graham the exact words she had used. I told him only that it had become more specific. He rubbed a hand over his face. It always does. Then why are we still working like this? Because the bridges stay open, he said, and there was such exhausted bitterness in it that I finally heard the accusation nested inside the job. These structures did not merely endure the phenomenon. They justified enduring it. Remote communities depended on them. Freight depended on them. Emergency routes depended on them. Every disappearing worker could be administratively reframed as a tragic exception against a larger necessity. I thought of Tacoma then, of cost-benefit language, of percentages and acceptable risk. Horror and bureaucracy are often adjacent rooms. I started testing my own rules in small ways, not to provoke the thing but to limit its leverage. If a voice called my name from below, I answered no questions and left. If I met a worker in fog, I checked boots, breath, footprints, radio call signs. Twice this likely saved me from nothing. Once it may have saved me from something. That was on Harrow Bridge at dusk. I met Warren coming toward me on a maintenance walk supposedly closed for repainting. He asked where Graham had reassigned the lane closure truck. His voice was Warren's, his gait Warren's, his coat marked with Warren's name patch. But Warren had called out sick that morning. I looked down. The graded deck was wet from mist. My boots had left dark prints. His had not. He saw me notice. The expression on his face did not change, but something in the posture emptied out, as if the performance had shifted resources elsewhere. Did the fog reach the water? He asked. No, I said, and stepped backward. He nodded as though satisfied, then turned and walked into the thicker fog at the bend. I followed for 3 paces before I realized there should have been footfall sound ahead of me, and there was none. After that, I stopped believing the old rules could be obeyed mechanically. They were not laws of nature. They were snapshots of previous encounters, useful only until the thing adjusted. Sarah, to my surprise, understood this before I said it aloud. We were in the Mercer workshop replacing a failed light relay when she said, without preamble, "It's using the rules now, isn't it?" I looked up from the cabinet. "What makes you say that?" My uncle worked South Reach before they closed that route. He told me the first version of the rules was shorter. Then people started surviving one way for a while, and later that same behavior got them cornered. She tightened a terminal screw. Animals do that. So do people. Learn where the fence is. This isn't an animal. No, she said. Animals usually want one thing. It was the closest anybody besides Graham had come to discussing the phenomenon as a shared fact. The relief I felt was ugly and disproportionate. Fear isolates fastest when language fails around it. A single calm acknowledgement can feel like oxygen. We did not trust each other exactly, but we started exchanging observations in fragments. She had seen a fairy manifest repopulate with names removed years earlier. I told her about the missing pages. She told me veterans sometimes changed routes without entering the reasons anywhere. I told her about Lisa. She did not ask who Lisa was. By then, the incidents were escalating beyond privacy. A relief crew on North Shoal reported seeing maintenance lights ignite across a closed span while the power to that entire section was off. A station cook found muddy bare footprints leading into a locked communications room and no prints leaving. Warren resigned after refusing to explain why he had started taping the names of his dead relatives inside his hard hat. The bridges still stood. Traffic still crossed. Official bulletins still described only weather delays, staffing adjustments, and non-critical system anomalies. But the thing beneath the bridges had become bold enough to anticipate our caution. That was when the storm warnings began. And with them, the last illusion that the rules were about survival rather than management. The storm system arrived as a broad coastal front, the kind the Weather Service described in measured terms that meant misery for anyone working near open water. By afternoon, the wind had shifted southeast and strengthened. Ferries suspended service on 2 routes. Rain hit the bridge decks in flat white sheets. The control station radios began picking up static bursts that swallowed entire sentences. We moved from routine maintenance to storm posture. Lane checks, drainage monitoring, standby crews on island stations, generators fueled, emergency shelters opened in case any remote access roads failed. Bad weather usually made the network feel more ordinary. Under enough logistical pressure, superstition yields to task lists. That had been true before. This time communications failed first. Not all at once. One bridge lost camera feed. Another reported relay lag. North Shoal stopped responding on voice radio but continued transmitting garbled sensor packets for 20 minutes after. By evening, 3 spans were effectively isolated except for intermittent truck-to-truck contact and whatever landline systems the storms had not yet drowned in static. Graham, Sarah, and I were on Mercer Station when the first figure appeared inside the fenced yard. It was broad daylight, if daylight can still be called that under storm cloud. Rain hammered the corrugated roof. I was pulling storm grates from the storage wall when Sarah froze beside the bay door. Someone stood just beyond the chain-link perimeter, hands at their sides, staring into the yard. Orange authority shell. Hot, hot. No vehicle. No rain gear movement. Water struck the figure and slid off with an odd uniform sheen, as if the fabric had no nap or seam. Graham saw it and went very still. "Who is that?" I asked. He did not answer. The figure took 1 step closer. Through the rain, I recognized the face. It took me a second because I had only seen the badge photo once in an old personnel binder. Tom Dacey. Missing, presumed drowned, 16 months earlier. Sarah whispered, "That's not possible." The figure raised one hand and knocked twice against the fence post. Graham shut the bay door so hard the frame rang. "What does that mean?" I said. "It means it isn't waiting below anymore." The storm deepened by nightfall. Power held in unstable pockets. We ran on backup at intervals. Trucks sent to verify one closed route did not report back for 90 minutes. Then radioed in from the opposite direction claiming they had never left their assigned bridge. A crew on Alder Reach swore they saw pedestrians walking calmly along the shoulder during a total lane closure. But the traffic cameras showed empty pavement. Every ordinary failure, flooded conduit, sensor drift, lightning interference, became impossible to separate from the other thing. Around 11 p.m., Graham finally told us what the veterans had really been doing all these years. Not the rules. The losses. We were in the control room with the emergency lamps on, rain stuttering against the windows. He stood over the map board with one hand braced on the desk and said it in the tone of a man confessing not a single crime but an entire profession's habit. When it fixated on somebody, he said, management moved them. Sarah stared at him. Transferred them. Sometimes reassigned. Sometimes pushed them to quit. Sometimes just left them on lighter routes until the incidents followed. Followed, I said. He looked at me then, and I understood he had been delaying this specifically because of how it would sound to someone like me, someone fluent in institutional euphemism. The bridges were never containing it, he said. They were tracing where it moved easiest. I felt cold despite the overheated room. You knew people were being used as bait. I knew people were being triaged. That's the same thing with cleaner paperwork. His face twitched. Not disagreement, just fatigue making room for honesty. Yes. Sarah swore under her breath and shoved back from the desk. How many? He gave a tiny, helpless movement with one shoulder. Officially? Very few. Actually, I stopped counting when they started splitting incident files across districts. And nobody shut the system down? He laughed once without humor. You shut this network down in winter and see who counts as acceptable collateral. There it was again, the arithmetic that turns human beings into maintenance variables. Then he said the worst part. It's not tied to the water anymore. The room held still around that sentence. He told us about sightings at ferry terminals miles from the main spans. A retired electrician who saw his missing partner in a grocery parking lot after leaving the authority. A janitor at Central who reported a wet worker standing in an elevator that never registered a floor request. Management had buried most of it because admitting spread would raise questions no agency wanted. The bridges acted like pathways, Graham said. Maybe amplifiers. Maybe habits it learned through us. But they were never prisons. Outside, through rain-blurred glass, the yard lights flickered. One after another they came on in a line leading from the maintenance gate toward the bridge access road. 3 of us watched. Nobody moved. They stopped after the 5th lamp. Not the full sequence from the rule. Just enough. Sarah said, "It's hurting us." Something hit the exterior wall with a dull, human-scale impact. Then another from farther down. Knocking. Not inside the pillars this time. On the station itself. I do not remember deciding to help Graham barricade the side corridor. I remember only the speed with which procedure fell away. We killed unnecessary lights, printed route maps, checked fuel, tried dead radios again and again. Sometime after midnight, a truck from North Shoal made contact long enough to report 2 missing inspectors and people on the catwalk where the catwalk washed out last year, then dissolved into static. In the middle of that chaos, Graham told me something I think he had known since I arrived. "It chose you early," he said. "I was standing by the locker bank, loading spare batteries into a waterproof case. Because I waved? Maybe before that. Some people are easier entries." Entries. He did not retract it. Regret gives it purchase. I wanted to deny that, but there was no language left for innocent resistance. Lisa's voice, the altered records, the way it had approached me through exactly the wound I carried. It all aligned too neatly. "Then why keep me here?" I asked. His answer was not immediate enough. "Because sometimes if it stays occupied, it leaves others alone." For a moment the storm sounds receded, and I saw the full shape of him. Not mentor, not guardian. A tired man who had spent years helping a machine of necessity decide whose fear was most useful. I almost hit him. Instead I asked, "Who did you trade before me?" He closed his eyes once. "Too many." By dawn the storm had isolated 4 bridges completely. 2 crews were unaccounted for. The figures were no longer rare glimpses below the spans. Workers reported seeing them in stairwells, equipment rooms, parking lots, even the reflection on darkened monitor screens. Whatever lived beneath the bridges had changed the terms. And every old rule, every inherited caution, had become part of the trail it used to reach us. Support Column 9 stood on Mercer's western quarter where the bridge crossed deepest water before reaching the artificial island. I had avoided it for months with the same practical obedience everyone else used. Schedule around sunset, do daylight checks only, keep the task brief. By the time Graham admitted the old rules had become liabilities, the column had changed from forbidden point to gravitational center. Reports clustered there. Knocking migrated there. 3 separate crews claimed to have seen missing workers entering the access shaft. One never came back out. So when the storm slackened just enough for a field attempt, we went anyway. Not because it was wise, because by then everything else felt like waiting to be cataloged. The team should have been larger. It was just Graham, Sarah, and me in full rain gear with chest waders, clipped lines, waterproof lamps, and a paper map of the service interiors because electronics had grown unreliable around the column. We reached the base access just after midnight. Rain still fell, though lighter now. Swell struck the supports below with a deep bodily force I felt through my boots. The entry hatch into Column 9 was a vertical steel door set behind a maintenance barrier, streaked with salt and old paint. Graham keyed the lock. The hinges opened with a wet, reluctant groan. Inside, the air was colder than the storm. Not merely damp cold. Submerged cold, the kind that seems to originate in concrete itself. The beam of my lamp caught ladder rungs, conduit runs, tide markers, and the cylindrical interior shaft descending farther than I had expected. The column had been modified repeatedly over decades. Platforms had been added, sealed, reopened, bridged over. Old bolts protruded from newer patchwork. It smelled of rust, algae, wet insulation, and something faintly sweet underneath, like paper going bad in a closed room. We descended to the first service platform and heard knocking below. 3 knocks. Pause. 2. Sarah looked at Graham. What version of that do we follow? He did not answer because there was none left worth trusting. That was the point where I understood the old strategy, obedience as protection, had ended. The rules depended on predictable human behavior. The entity used prediction better than we did. Every conditioned response became a handle. So I did the only useful thing I had done since arriving. I stopped following. I moved past Graham and continued downward before either of them could object. The knocking ceased immediately, as if listening. On the next platform, the lights overhead should have been dead. Instead, one flickered on as I stepped beneath it, then off once I passed. A sequence. I kept going. Evan, Graham hissed. I ignored him. At the bottom of the shaft, a lateral service tunnel opened into a chamber half flooded with black water. My lamp found filing cabinets half submerged, old record boxes stacked on corroded pallets, and a concrete wall covered with names written in marker, grease pencil, and scratched lettering. Hundreds of names. Some with dates, some crossed out, some circled, some repeated in different hands across different eras. The missing were here at least as records if not bodies. A surge of water sloshed against my boots. Sarah dropped beside me a second later, swearing softly. Graham arrived after, breathing hard, anger and fear moving over his face too quickly to separate. "What are those?" she asked. I stepped closer to the wall. There were recent names I recognized from station gossip. Names from old journals. Names of workers transferred years ago. Near the bottom, newly written, was Evan Cross. Not circled yet, just present. The chamber lights came on. Every one of them at once, though no live power should have reached that depth. Across the far grating where another tunnel narrowed into darkness, figures began to resolve. Lisa first, then Warren, then Tom Dacey from the fence, then a welder whose memorial sticker still sat on a workshop refrigerator, then a man I recognized from Tacoma but could not name, then Graham, though the real Graham stood behind me, then Sarah, then, at the center, me. They were not solid in the normal sense, more like decisions wearing bodies. Each carried enough accurate detail to destabilize refusal. Wet fabric sheen, familiar posture, the tiny asymmetry of my own left shoulder from an old climbing injury. The copies did not lunge. They watched. The one wearing my face spoke. It used my voice exactly, including the slight flattening that happened when I was tired. You came down because you thought being first would matter. Graham said, "Don't answer." The copies smiled with various degrees of understanding. Lisa stepped forward. "He always answers late." The thing in my shape tilted its head. "Who did you leave on the bridge, Evan?" There it was, not a threat. An audit. The old rules would have demanded silence, retreat, refusal. Predictable fear. Instead, I stepped into the chamber water until it reached mid-shin and said, "You already know." For the first time, several of the figures seemed to lose exactness around the mouth and eyes, as if the reply had arrived out of order. Tried again through Lisa. "Say her name." I thought of the injured inspector in Tacoma, the one who had been on the maintenance way when the corroded section failed. Her name was Dana Voss. I had not said it aloud in over a year. "Dana Voss," I said. The water rippled outward, though nothing had moved beneath it. Graham grabbed my arm. "Stop engaging." "No," I said, and pulled free. That startled him more than the figures. The thing changed tactics. My own double took a step closer to the grating. "You altered numbers. You delayed repair. You called it interpretation." "Yes." Something in the chamber pressure shifted. Not relief. Not safety. Confusion, maybe. The questions had been built to extract what I would avoid. By admitting the sequence without bargaining, I denied it the familiar shape of pursuit. So I kept going. "I came here because I thought remote work would feel smaller," I said. "I stayed because I thought I could manage this if I understood it. And you like people who think rules can save them from what they did." "Behind me," Sarah said very quietly. "What are you doing?" Something new. The copies blurred at their edges. Not vanishing. Recalculating. The one shaped like Graham spoke next, but its voice was wrong. Too many overtones, as if several recordings were trying to agree. "Whose loss bought your place?" That question hit harder because I knew the answer might be true in more than one direction. Somebody before me. Several somebodies. Graham's silence. Management transfers. All of it. I took another step forward instead of back. "You tell me," I said. The figures recoiled a fraction. Not in fear. In uncertainty. That was when I understood the last piece. The phenomenon was adaptive, intelligent in a way I do not know how to classify, but it had been trained by decades of procedural human behavior. It expected denial, avoidance, ritual compliance, fear responses organized into repeatable paths. It knew how to lean against those grooves. Unpatterned admission disrupted it. Not defeated it. Nothing that easy. Just interrupted its confidence. I moved past the grating into the forbidden tunnel. Graham shouted. Sarah cursed and splashed after me. Beyond the threshold, the concrete narrowed and the air grew sharply colder. On the wall to my left, written over older markings, were more sentences. It uses containment language. Do not make it the investigator. Column 9 is a mouth, not an origin. Then, lower, in fresher handwriting I recognized as my own. If it finishes your account for you, you belong to its version. I stopped. I had no memory of writing that. Behind us, the figures in the chamber began asking questions all at once in voices belonging to the dead, the missing, the retired, and the living. The tunnel amplified them until language turned granular. Graham reached me first. "We leave. Now." He was right, finally, because leaving was not retreat within the old pattern anymore. We had already broken the script. On the way back up, the maintenance lights in the shaft ignited in no sequence I had ever been taught. Not ahead of us. Not behind. Alternating sides, skipping levels, answering some geometry the bridge had never possessed. At the top hatch, I looked back once. Far below in the chamber, all the figures had turned their faces upward, including mine. Officially, the post-storm investigations found no evidence of a systemic threat, only compounding operational failures under severe weather conditions. 2 workers remained missing. 1 truck was recovered from a service turnout with no occupants and no sign of struggle. Several incident logs were reclassified, consolidated, or archived behind access levels I no longer had. Central sent counselors for 3 days, auditors for 1, and a policy revision team for a week. They asked about power instability, emergency routing, radio reliability, fatigue management, and whether veteran crews had developed informal practices that complicated compliance. That phrase nearly made me laugh. Graham took administrative leave and did not come back. I heard later he retired, though I never saw a notice. Sarah transferred inland to a river crossing unit after telling me, with more kindness than I deserved, that staying near Mercer would either make me useful or make me legible to the wrong thing. She did not specify which she expected. I stayed. I have told myself several reasons. Somebody had to keep paper records. Somebody had to compare the new incidents against the old without trusting policy language. Somebody had to watch whether Column 9 changed after the storm. All of those are true. Another truth is less flattering. I no longer trusted distance. If the thing had already learned the network and the workers and the habits that linked them, leaving might only mean encountering it elsewhere without the partial vocabulary the bridges had given me. So I stayed where the geometry was at least familiar. The revised maintenance handbook arrived 3 months later in sealed packets distributed to every station and route truck. New cover design, updated emergency tables, revised tide hazard graphics, standard bureaucratic effort to make continuity look like progress. Inside was a new rule sheet. There were now 6 rules. The first 5 had been reworded, stripped of some superstition and some precision in exactly the way management always preferred. Rule 1 no longer mentioned waving. It referred to non-essential visual engagement with persons below restricted infrastructure zones. Rule 5 became ignore non-operational acoustic stimuli within support cavities. Whoever wrote the revision wanted liability-resistant language more than survival. Then there was Rule 6. If a worker tells you the old rules are still effective, do not believe them. At the bottom of the page, under revision authorship, was my name. E. Cross, Field Review Contributor. I sat in the Mercer office with the booklet open under fluorescent light and waited for memory to rise. Nothing did. I had submitted notes after the storm, yes. Handwritten observations, contradictions, warnings that fixed rules degraded under repetition. But I had no memory of writing that sentence or approving its inclusion. The phrasing was close to mine, close enough to bruise, but not exact. It read like somebody who had listened to me thinking and cleaned it for circulation. I checked the digital revision record. It showed my credentials attached to a document upload made at 3:11 on a night I had spent on bridge closure duty with 2 other workers who later confirmed I had never left the control room. I printed the page immediately and filed it in my private folder. After that, I began making my own manual. Paper only. Dated entries. No deletions, only strike-throughs. I wrote what held and what failed, what repeated and what changed. I stopped trying to name the phenomenon beyond the practical terms necessary to track it. Naming invites category, and category invites procedural optimism. Some things become more dangerous when institutions decide they understand them. Still, there were changes I could not ignore. Reports of figures beneath the bridges decreased, but reports near connected infrastructure increased. Toll pullouts, ferry slips, storage yards, even the municipal parking lot near the mainland office. The appearances grew less dramatic and more integrated. A former rigger was seen filling a gas tank on camera at 2 a.m. with no vehicle registered at the pump. A missing inspector's badge swiped an interior station door from the outside while the building alarm remained armed. People no longer described only fear. Sometimes they described recognition so sudden it felt like longing. That last part worried me most. Fear is disruptive. Longing is cooperative. The bridges remained open. Traffic statistics normalized. Public memory shortened. New hires arrived with clean boots and tired eyes. Some took the rules seriously. Some smiled at them the way I once had. I tried not to become Graham. I failed in certain tones. I found myself pausing before answering questions I would once have brushed aside. I caught younger workers watching my face for cues I did not want to give. Once, a new inspector asked why the procedures kept changing. Because whatever they describe keeps learning, I said. He laughed uncertainly, waiting for the joke underneath. I did not provide one. The last incident I can report cleanly happened on a morning route in late autumn. when the first hard cold had begun sharpening the air but before snow reached the lower elevations. Fog lay low over Mercer Channel, thick enough to erase the far shore while leaving the towers visible from midspan upward, as if the bridge had been built over absence. I was alone on the inspection walk, checking drainage at the south quarter. Low tide. I knew that before I looked over the rail. You can feel low tide in the acoustics. More exposed surfaces, sharper return off rock and retaining wall. Still, I looked. Far below, standing on the black exposed seam beneath the span, were figures. Dozens of them. Not scattered. Arranged loosely, like workers waiting for transport. Every face was turned upward. At first I thought they were strangers and felt the old, stupid relief of anonymity. Then the details resolved. Tom Dacey, Warren, people from the old station photos. Names from the wall in column 9. A deckhand who vanished before my hiring. An electrician whose locker had stayed untouched for a year. Graham, though I had heard he was alive inland. Sarah, which made my throat close hard enough to hurt even though I had spoken to her by phone 2 weeks earlier. And others I knew only from memorial notices, archive notebooks, or badge photos attached to incident files. No strangers at all. Only people who had once maintained the bridges. All of them smiling. Not broadly. Not grotesquely. With the mild expression of workers acknowledging somebody arriving for shift. I did not wave. I did not speak. I stood so still my harness line stopped trembling. Then I made the mistake of blinking. When I looked back, some of them were closer to the base of the support than they should have been able to move in that time, though none had changed posture. The fog slid around their boots without obscuring them. Behind the cluster, where the tide line should have glistened empty, I saw more faces waiting to resolve. I forced myself to turn away. Across the span ahead of me, the maintenance lights began to illuminate. Not the old sequence. Not the warning described on the card. This pattern skipped the standard intervals and crossed lanes, igniting opposing fixtures in mirrored pairs that traveled outward, then inward, then stopped halfway as if testing symmetry. It looked less like a malfunction than a demonstration. I knew every documented light behavior on Mercer. I knew the maintenance circuits, the relay cabinets, the storm bypasses, the fail-safe diagnostics. This pattern belonged to none of them. I took one step backward. The next pair of lights came on. From below, though I never turned to confirm it, I heard the soft collective sound of people beginning to climb. I am writing this now because records matter even when they fail, and because the old comfort of procedure is exactly how this thing educated itself through us. If you work these bridges after me, understand this much. The rules were never laws. They were footprints. And whatever lives beneath, within, or along this network no longer needs us to make the first mistake for it.